Recording in progress.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We are here today to go through an air quality informational session and public hearing. And this one is for Michigan Potash Operating LLC. We've got a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to try to get right into it here. My name is Jennifer Dixon, and I'm going to be moderating tonight. And I have a lot of staff that I'm going to introduce you to in just a couple minutes. But before that, I want to go through some housekeeping items just so that folks know how the evening is going to run and some key things that you might want to know if you want to participate a little bit more in tonight's meeting. So the first thing is your lines are going to be muted. This meeting is being recorded, and we will share the link to the recording as well as these PowerPoint slides and a bunch of information that we'll cover later just to make sure you have it at your fingertips. We will be sharing that probably tomorrow or maybe Monday at the latest, just so that you have it available to you to use as we work through the rest of the comment period. So how things are going to work tonight, I always like to talk through this a little bit because there are going to be two sort of separate portions of the evening. The first part of the evening is the informational session, and during that part of the evening, we're going to be talking through a little bit about the air quality division, about EGLE's air quality division, what our role is in regulating sources like Michigan Potash. And during that session, we're going to have our permit engineer and our inspector kind of giving you a little bit of an overview of what the company has requested from us through this permitting process. Once we get through that, we will open things up to question and answer. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of an opportunity to get some of the questions that you might have, respond to those questions, give you a little bit of feedback. One thing I do want to note about that is that as we worked through this process so far, we understand that there's a lot of questions that aren't related to air quality. So I want to just put that out there and I'll remind folks as well a little bit later, but the staff that we have online right now are from our air quality division. So we're really going to be focusing on this permit tonight. However, if you have questions unrelated to air quality, we're happy to pass those on to staff that will get back to you with answers to your questions. Another thing that I want to mention that I'll also mention again at the end of the presentation tonight is that we are going to be having an in-person EGLE meeting on February 5th. I'll give you the details about that as well, but we'll have multiple divisions there. So we'll have folks from air, water, and our geological resources divisions there to help answer some more of the questions that people have that are a little bit broader than air quality related things. So that's how we're going to run the first part. We'll get to that presentation, we'll do the question and answer, and then at 7 o'clock or whenever your questions are done, whatever comes earlier, we will switch over to the hearing portion of the night. So the hearing portion of the night is a little bit more controlled, I guess I would say. And what we'll be doing then is we'll start it off with a statement to just open the hearing. We'll take your comments on the record, but if you have any questions at that time, some people do like to put questions in their comments. We won't be responding to them. We're just going to be putting those on the record, and we'll respond to them after the public comment period closes. So those are the two parts of the evening. And again, we'll go through that a couple of times, but I just like to set the table a little bit as we get started here. There's another thing that we really like to talk through when we have meetings and hearings like this, and that's kind of our group norms. So what our group norms are, it's a set of sort of rules that we use to make sure that these public meetings go smoothly for everyone and that everyone gets an opportunity to participate. These group norms were developed with a group of Flint advocates and in partnership with EGLE. So the first one is listen actively with an ear to understanding. So of course, we're here to hopefully provide you information that will help you understand what the company is asking of us. We want you to ask questions and request clarification. It's really important that we try to get you the answers that you need so that any comments that you make on this proposed permit will be helpful. We want to make sure we're criticizing ideas and not people. That's really important. We want to communicate respectfully. So that goes for us here at EGLE and also for participants in the meeting. And then the other thing we want to do is take space and make space. And what that means is just giving space and time for everybody to be able to participate how they'd like to. So I'm going to walk through a quick agenda, but the first thing I want to do before I start introducing all the EGLE staff to you is I want to introduce to you our decision maker, Annette Switzer. And I know she wants to formally welcome everybody to the meeting tonight. So Annette, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take the mic.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. As Jen said, I'm Annette Switzer. I'm the Division Director with Air Quality, and I'm also the decision maker for this permit action. Talking with community members is an important part of our permitting process, and the comments we receive often lead to positive changes. Tonight, you'll hear more about how we review the technical information required by permit applications and the types of comments we can and cannot use in our decisions. Andy, our lead permit engineer, will share more details about the draft permit and parts of it that may be of particular interest to you. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. We hope you ask questions and share your thoughts and comments on the proposed air permit. As a decision maker, I'll be listening closely to the conversation tonight. Thank you all again for being here. And with that, Jen, I will pass it back to you so we can get the rest of the conversation started.
Thank you, Annette. I appreciate you. So you just met Annette. I'm going to introduce everybody else that's here on the panel. So if I can have all my panelists turn your cameras on, that would be really helpful. That way folks at home can see who's here. So the first person I'm going to introduce to you is Andy Drury. As I mentioned, he is our lead permit engineer. So you're going to be hearing a lot from him tonight. He's really going to walk you through what Air Quality Division does, and then his process for reviewing this permit application. The next person I want to introduce to you is Tammy Poit, and she is the inspector. She's up north over there by the facility, and she will be also talking about her inspector role. So everybody can have a little bit of more of an idea is if this permit goes forward and the facility is constructed, not instructed, Jennifer, constructed, sorry about that, what she will be doing to inspect the facility, keep track of them, looking over their record keeping and all of those kinds of things. So you'll hear from her as well. Other folks that we have online are Alec Konecki. So he is our air modeler for this facility. And we'll talk a little bit more about air modeling, but briefly overview, air modeling is when we use a computer to simulate or future cast what emissions from the proposed project would be if it was in reality. We also have Matt Risley. He works for our air monitoring section, so that's a little bit different. He helps look at regional air monitoring information from our stationary air monitors, and we can hear a little bit more from him later as well. We also have Rick Welsh on the line. So Rick is our toxicologist on this project. So high level, what toxicologists do in permits is when a permit application comes in that has toxic air contaminants that need to be regulated, our toxicologists help us evaluate those. They also work to create health-based screening levels for almost 1,300 different air toxics for the state. I think I got everyone there except for our super helper, Kaitlyn DeVries. She doesn't like to turn her camera on. She's a little bit shy, but she really helps us keep on track and make sure that the meeting goes smoothly. So Kaitlyn, thanks for being here tonight as well. All right, Andy, if you want to keep your camera on, that would be great. Everyone else, you guys can go ahead and turn your cameras off, at least for a little bit here. Just quickly going through the agenda, as we mentioned, Andy's going to run us through the informational session. He's going to discuss the proposed permit, and then Tammy's going to round that out, talking about the compliance aspects of that. We'll roll right into question and answer. You're going to want to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to type in questions that you have. And if you really feel strongly about asking them verbally, we can handle that as well. But a lot of people like to type those questions in as Andy or whoever the permit engineer is talking, so they can make sure they get those answered. Then we'll do that public hearing, like I mentioned, at 7 o'clock or whenever we get through the Q&A, whatever comes first. Sometimes I try to roll a little bit past 7. We'll see where we are with things. We will definitely talk about how you can submit an official comment. So you do not have to comment tonight. Even if you said when you registered that you wanted to comment, you can always say no tonight. There's plenty of time to still submit your comments in a variety of other ways by the end of the comment period, which is January 27th. So we'll go over those. We'll also go over where you can find other information, talk a little bit more about that next meeting on February 5th, where other EGLE staff are going to be in person up there. And then we'll talk about who you can contact with further questions. So with that being said, Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to let you advance the slides here so that we can make sure that things are working as they're supposed to before I sign off. That looks perfect. So I'll make sure I can hear you too.
Yep, I got to get you guys out of my screen so I can find my notes. There we go. All right.
Yep, you look good, so go right ahead.
All right, thank you. My name is Andy, and I'm the lead permit engineer for Michigan Potash's air permit application. I worked with a team of air quality staff, including some of those on our panel, to review the application. Before we get into the details of the project, I would like to talk about what the Air Quality Division does and how the permitting process works. Air pollution comes from many different sources, including power plants, fuel-burning vehicles, and various industrial sources. The overall mission of the AQD is to protect public health and the environment. We provide this protection by using our authority under state and federal laws through the regulation of industrial sources. AQD staff do a lot of different things. We monitor levels of air pollutants. We look at toxic air contaminants to make sure public health is protected. We conduct inspections of facilities to make sure they comply with the rules and their permits. And we review applications and write permits for sources of air pollutants to make sure the proposed projects comply with state and federal rules to protect public health. Our rules require us to issue permits to sources of air pollutants. However, I'd like to point out a few things that the draft permit does not cover and that we aren't able to regulate. These include zoning, noise, light, and traffic on public roads. If you have questions or concerns about these issues, you'll want to talk to your local government. What people think about a project is important. However, when making a decision on a permit application, we can't consider whether people want the project to be done. Whether people think the project is needed is also important, but we can't consider that when making a decision on an air permit application. We have to evaluate the project to ensure it meets the applicable air quality rules. If the project meets those rules, we are required to issue the permit. Many people have commented about Michigan Potash's proposed solution mining wells, disposal wells, water withdrawal for the facility, and proposed changes to wetlands. When making a decision on the air permit application, the AQD cannot consider these because they are outside our authority to regulate. The wells are regulated by US EPA and EGLE's Geologic Resources Management Division. Water withdrawal is overseen by EGLE's Geologic Resources Management Division, and wetlands are regulated by EGLE's Water Resources Division. So to make sure a company is meeting all rules and regulations, they need to follow a permit to install for the equipment. I'd like to give you a simple overview of the air permitting process. First, the company decides they want to install, modify, or construct a source of air emissions. Then the company submits a permit application. The application is then reviewed by an engineer like myself to decide if their request can meet the state and federal air quality rules. During the review, other air quality staff are involved to help with different parts of the review, like the members on our panel. This includes the review of toxic air contaminants, also called TACs, and how the emissions may impact the surrounding community. If these rules are met, the engineer creates a draft permit. If public comment is required, as in this case, the draft permit is posted for the public to comment on. Public comment is a very important part of the permitting process, which is why we are talking with you tonight. Once the comment period ends, we evaluate all of the comments submitted. The comments can lead to changes in the permit and the final decision. And finally, a decision is made on the permit application. This decision could be to approve the permit as written, approve the permit with changes, or to deny the permit. This decision is based on whether what the company wants to do can meet the air quality regulations. Some of you may wonder what potash is. Potash is potassium chloride. It is often mined with other minerals, such as salt. A primary use of potash is as fertilizer for food production. According to Michigan Potash, fertilizer is the intended use of the potash they would produce. Michigan Potash currently has an air permit for the proposed facility. In this permit application, they were requesting to increase the thermal oxidizer heat input from 5.5 million British thermal units, or BTU, per hour to 20 million BTU per hour, and increase the emission limits for particulate matter equal to or less than 10 microns in diameter, called PM10, and the particulate matter equal to or less than 2.5 microns in diameter, called PM2.5, from 88 tons per year to 93 tons per year. Because the facility has not been built yet, we evaluated the emissions from the entire facility, not just the proposed changes. So let's talk about how Michigan Potash's proposed facility would work. I will start with an overview and then go into more details. I'm only going to talk about the processes that will have air emissions. So brine, which is a liquid containing salt and potash, would be extracted from underground and routed to an air stripper. From there, the salt and potash would be separated in a crystallization and evaporation process. And then they would be dried, cooled, compacted, packaged, stored, and loaded for shipment from the facility. So first, let's talk about the sweetening process that would use air stripping. Brine containing salt, potash, and potentially hydrogen sulfide, known as H2S, would come from the wells. Because H2S is a gas, air stripping would be used to remove H2S from the brine. Depending on the amount of H2S in the brine, different air pollution control devices would be required. Michigan Potash would have to measure the H2S concentration in the brine every hour. If the brine is sweet, with less than 60 parts per million hydrogen sulfide, the air from the air stripper would go directly to the caustic scrubber to control the H2S emissions. If the brine is sour, with more than 60 parts per million H2S, the air from the air stripper would go to a thermal oxidizer, where most of the H2S would be converted to sulfur dioxide before going to the caustic scrubber. After the air stripper, the salt and potash would be separated through crystallization and evaporation for further processing. So salt would be processed as follows. Wet salt from crystallization and evaporation would be dried in a natural gas-fired dryer. A cyclone would be used to collect salt product, and a wet scrubber would be used to control salt emissions to the air. Dried salt would then go through cooling, compaction, and packaging. A cyclone would be used to collect salt product, and a baghouse dust collector would be used to control salt emissions to the air. Salt would then go to storage and be loaded into trucks for shipment from the facility. Note the trucks taking salt from the facility are mobile sources and are not regulated by the air permitting program as they travel on the public roads. Potash would be processed in a similar way. Wet potash from crystallization and evaporation would be dried in a natural gas-fired dryer. A cyclone would be used to collect potash product, and a wet scrubber would be used to control potash emissions to the air. Dried potash would then go through cooling and compaction. A cyclone would be used to collect potash product, and a baghouse dust collector would be used to control potash emissions to the air. Potash would then go to storage and be loaded into trucks for shipment from the facility. And as I said, trucks taking potash from the facility are also not regulated by the air permitting program. So now that we've talked about what Michigan Potash is requesting, let's talk about how we review a permit application. When reviewing a proposed project, the permit engineer works with other air quality staff. This review includes the state and federal rules that apply to the project, evaluating the proposed air emissions against the rules that apply. This includes checking the emission calculations, an air toxics review to make sure toxic air contaminants meet AQD's health-based screening levels, and air modeling for criteria pollutants and toxic air contaminants when needed. We need to know if Michigan Potash's proposed project meets these requirements. I'm going to talk in more detail about the different parts of the review in the coming slides. So in this slide, I will talk about the categories or groups of air pollutants, and then a bit about what Michigan Potash is proposing. The first group are criteria pollutants. This is a small group of well-studied and regulated pollutants, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, PM10 and PM2.5. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, known as EPA, sets national ambient air quality standards, referred to as NAAQS, for these pollutants to protect public health and the environment. Any releases of these pollutants must be below the NAAQS. Hazardous air pollutants, known as HAPs, are a larger group of pollutants. These are known or suspected to cause health effects or environmental effects. We regulate these pollutants by applying the federal regulations. If specific regulations apply to the proposed facility, as in this case, then we review these pollutants through the federal rules. toxic air contaminants are a larger group of pollutants covered by Michigan rules. They include almost any air pollutant, including hazardous air pollutants. Our rules allow our toxicologists to set health-based screening levels for toxic air contaminants. Pollutants being released must meet these health-based screening levels. I will talk a little bit more about these different pollutants in the next few slides. So this table shows the potential regulated pollutant emissions for Michigan Potash's proposed facility. This information can also be found in Table 1 of the technical fact sheet. These emissions account for the entire project and the air pollution control equipment. The potential emissions from the proposed project are less than their major source threshold, so the project is not subject to additional permit review that would otherwise be required. I want to talk in more detail about toxic air contaminants and their health-based screening levels. The screening levels are designed to protect against health issues, including developing cancer or breathing problems. When we performed our review of the application, we looked at all toxic air contaminants from the entire proposed facility. Our review of the proposed emissions and the modeling, which I will talk about next, determined the proposed emissions would comply with the health-based screening levels. So what is modeling and why is it important to the review of a permit application? Computer modeling predicts what concentrations people in the area could be exposed to under the worst-case scenarios. The modeling simulates a grid of virtual air monitors surrounding the facility. This allows the highest concentration to be considered. Modeling was done for toxic air contaminants and the criteria pollutants nitrogen dioxide, PM10, PM2.5, and sulfur dioxide. The modeling included emissions from the entire facility, but did not include the trucks on public roadways because they are not regulated through the air permitting program. The modeling showed the proposed emissions of all TACs meet their health-based screening levels. Cadmium was closest to its screening level at 41%. The criteria pollutants would also be in compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. PM2.5 was closest to its air quality standard at 70%. Note this includes the background concentration from the Houghton Lake monitor. More details on the modeling results are in the technical fact sheet. So let's talk about what a permit is, and then I will give you more details about the proposed permit for Michigan Potash. A permit is a legally enforceable document with a list of requirements called conditions the company must comply with. The requirements in the permit ensure the project operates as described in the application and the way it was reviewed by myself and the rest of the AQD permitting team. A permit has requirements such as emission limits, material limits, proper operating parameters for control devices and other equipment, and monitoring, record keeping, and reporting. The proposed draft conditions for Michigan Potash include the following requirements. There are hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide emission limits on the air stripping system. There are PM10 and PM2.5 emission limits on the salt and potash drying and compaction processes. There is a limit on the hydrogen sulfide concentration of the brine coming into the facility. There are requirements to properly operate and maintain the air pollution control devices, including scrubbers, the thermal oxidizer, cyclones, and dust collectors. There are operating parameters to make sure the control devices are working properly. A malfunction abatement plan to prevent, detect, and correct future potential malfunctions or equipment failures resulting in unanticipated emissions is required. The malfunction abatement plan must be approved by the AQD. Requirements of federal rules are included to ensure compliance with the federal regulations. Michigan Potash would have to test the hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide emissions from air stripping and the particulate emissions from the dryers and cooling and compaction processes to make sure the emission limits are met. Michigan Potash would have to monitor the hydrogen sulfide content of the brine, the hydrogen sulfide emissions from the air stripping process, the control device operating parameters, and the amount of natural gas used. And Michigan Potash would be required to notify the AQD when they begin operation. So I will now turn the presentation over to Tammy.
Hi, my name is Tammy Poit. I am the inspector for the proposed facility and for Osceola County for air pollution. I'm located out of the Cadillac District office, and my role is to determine if the company's operation is in compliance with the permit and all those things that Andy said in the previous two slides. I do this by conducting inspections periodically, reviewing the company's reports, records. I observe their visual emissions and just keep an eye on what the plant is doing. I review and observe emission tests. And the proposed permit has emission limits for various pollutants, including visual emissions. The company can demonstrate continuous compliance by emission tests, operating the process within the material limits in accordance with the parameters set during these tests, and continuously monitoring and recording the required parameters. Typically, an inspection entails the lists that are above. They need I obtain monitoring data and operational parameters to establish a baseline condition and to determine compliance with permit conditions. A lot of these baseline come from their testing. I review the company's records for compliance determinations. In the permit, it sets forth what these records are supposed to be. And then I perform visible emission observations, and I look to make sure the company is performing these observations as well. And I check to make sure they haven't installed any extra equipment that isn't in the permit that should be in the permit. Next slide, Andy. The emission tests are a really big method to show compliance. Myself, along with our technical programs unit staff, will go to observe these tests. The district, myself, makes sure the company operates in the same fashion during the other inspections, so they set these tests that set the parameters, and then I go to the company like 6 months later, 12 months later, a few years later, and I make sure that they're operating on these at the same parameters they were doing the testing. And I make sure all those records that they have to keep demonstrate that they were still maintaining these parameters. And that's how all that flows into the toxicology and all the stuff that goes into the permit that Andy reviews. And so emissions test is we determine that the test is being performed in accordance with designated test methods and protocols. They're to make sure the operation is under routine maximum conditions during the test, and that we record the operational parameters, which will be compared to during my later inspections, as I mentioned previously. And then a big part of the inspections is reviewing company records, their monitoring data and reports, and other mechanisms that they have to show compliance. So I evaluate the compliance of the operation. I identify any abnormalities. I look for monitoring parameter ranges that are set during these stack tests. I look at their control devices. I look at their monitors, make sure everything's working. All their calibrations have been done. Everything's working properly. And then all of that goes into is involved in assessing the emissions from the operation and making sure that they are being reported and recorded accurately. So back to you, Andy or Jen.
I think it's back to me, but thank you, Tammy. Appreciate you. Appreciate you walking us through all of that. I think now at this stage of the game, you all have heard from Andy, you've heard from Tammy. Hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of what exactly the company asked for and a better idea of the review that our staff do. We are going to move into that question and answer period now. So if I can have Tammy and Andy and Alec and Matt and Brick, please turn your cameras back on. and we'll move over into this session, this part of the evening. I also wanted to just let people know, sometimes folks ask this, and I know we've been working on this in the past, how many people are attending. So we do have 37 people outside of just the panelists here that are in attendance. So I wanted to let people know that. All right, so if you would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and type it into that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen there. There is a question in here. It came in right at the beginning, Andy, and I think it's when we were talking about the different pollutants. We were talking about toxic air contaminants, and I know as air quality division, you know, we speak this language every day, and there is a lot of different air pollutants that we regulate through our state and federal rules that we put in place and enforce. So one of the questions that had come in as far as pollutants is carbon a pollutant? So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, if that comes into play in any sort of applications that come in, or if it's something that you would see in an application, and if so, if there is any rules and regulations that would apply to it or not.
Yeah, so carbon is by itself an element, but typically when people are talking about carbon, they're more referring to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, I think, is typically what people are referring to. We do regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases if the facility is a major source. In the case of Michigan Potash, the facility is not a major source, so we do not regulate the carbon dioxide emissions that come from the facility.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's probably what we were talking about. And if it's not, like, please ask us to clarify that for sure. So a couple questions came in. These ones are going to be for you, Tammy, and it's kind of the same question. People that were on the same page on this one, but they're asking about how often would we do inspections. So I know you mentioned, or at least I think I heard you say that within, you know, the first few months of the company actually starting to operate, because that is one of the requirements. If this permit goes forward, once they start operating, they'll have to let us know that you do try to get out there pretty quickly once they start operating. And then we do go out periodically. So if you could talk a little bit about, you know, how those inspections might be scheduled. And by scheduled, I mean on your list, not necessarily that you call the company up and say like, hey, I'm on my way or anything like that. But then other things that might prompt you to go out and do an inspection or do a site visit, because they're not all inspections. Some of them might just be site visits too, right?
Right. Yeah. No, certainly. In the very beginning, as they install certain equipment in the permit, they have to let me know that it's installed. I'm typically, when we get a new source, involved, if not weekly, bi-weekly in emails or phone calls as they try to figure out, you know, anybody who's built anything, it doesn't always go smoothly. So I'll be very much involved as the plant gets built. I assume I'll be out there 3-4 times before it ever becomes up and operating. And then once it's operating, they have to give us notification of that. And then they have to do testing at 180 days. So I'll be there for that as well. And then once it's up and going, we typically in the Cadillac district at this level of a source, because it's one of our middle levels, we come out about every 3 years to do what we call a full compliance evaluation. And that is where I am looking at records for a full year. I'm going in, I'm comparing it to stack tests. I'm comparing it to the initial tests they're doing at 180 days. I'm looking at all the records and looking at calibrations and just making sure they're doing everything that permit has with a fine-tooth comb. And when I'm not there for that, I'm usually in the area every 3 to 4 months just doing a drive-by. I'm looking for visible emissions. I'm looking for any fallout around their packaging. Just kind of general housekeeping. And if I have any concerns, then I'm going to swing in and say, hey, you know, what's going on? I see this going on. And then if there's complaints, if you guys see odors, there's a lot of dust happening, that'll also generate me coming out. I sometimes will go out and actually just talk to the complainant. Other times I will go straight to the company and just kind of see if I can catch them doing what the complainant is doing. I spend a lot of time, or about half my time out in the field, just trying to work with companies and work with complainants and make sure everything is going and we're protecting Michigan's environment and keeping our communities safe.
Yeah, thanks for going through that, Tammy. I think the overall takeaway from that is the inspector's role really is, although we can't be on site every day, we don't we're not watching every nitty gritty thing the company is doing. Our job really is to have oversight of the air quality rules and regulations. So I appreciate your very thorough answer on that, because I know there's a lot of different reasons we might be out at the facility. So thank you for that. There was some questions, and I just want to remind folks that, because some people did come on late, we are going to be really focusing on the air permit today. We will talk a little bit more about an upcoming meeting that will handle other things like water, wells, things like that. I know Andy mentioned in the beginning too that these aren't things that our air quality staff can respond to, but we are getting some questions in the chat. Not a problem. We'll make sure those get to the right people and they'll respond directly to you. So Andy, this one is going to be for you. The question is related to hazardous air pollutants. So which hazardous air pollutants, it says which federal definition of HAPs is being applied, but I really think that, even though that was a question, I think what the question really is referring to is what are the specific HAPs that the facility will be emitted? What did the company request for us to review? What did we review? And then how are those potential emissions numbers derived? Like, how do we get them? What does your review look like when it comes to those types of emissions?
Yeah, the HAPs involved in this facility and the MACT or NESHAPs, those are the acronyms we use for these federal regulations, are primarily for the engines that they have, the emergency generator. I don't know the specific ones that are there. There are typically the combustion related ones. We can get a list of all the HAPs that they emit and that we looked at. I don't have that offhand.
So Andy, just before you move on, do you mind just defining what MACT and NESHAP is? Because I know you use those two acronyms, and I'm sure there's people that are like, okay, is that a word? I'm not sure what that is. So if you don't mind defining those.
Yep. So MACT is maximum available control technology, and NESHAP is National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. So they're kind of the same thing. They come out of Part 63 of the federal regulations. And so primarily the ones that Michigan Potash is subject to are their engines. So we looked at those. The engines, it's they're relatively simple. The engines that they get should be built to comply with those standards up front. And then for emission calculations for the engines, EPA has some pretty good emission factors for engines that are used based on the size of the engine. For other pollutants, it's based on a variety of factors. Emission factors developed by EPA, engineering calculations for different processes, efficiencies of control devices, and things like that.
Yeah, thanks for walking through that. I know there's a lot of review that comes into play, especially when we're looking at those federal regulations that you mentioned, and those are specific for those hazardous air pollutants. So it's definitely an important part of the review process. This came up in our conversations earlier this week as we were getting ready for this hearing. And the question is, can you talk a little bit about what the community could expect for odor emissions? So I can't remember off the top of my head, Andy, and I apologize if we did any review of odors. I know we talked about H2S, which we see sometimes in other communities can create odors for community members that will get complaints about. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that. And then I might move over. I know Tammy talked a little bit about the complaint process, but if she has anything else to potentially add to what you talk about, we might move over to her for a second too. But I'd have you talk a little bit about what we think folks might be able to expect from potential odors from the facility.
Yeah, hydrogen sulfide would be the one that would be most likely to generate odors. And as people know, there are the Cargill facility. I think there have been odor issues with that facility. Part of the difference is that one is very old, and it was built under different standards. So Michigan Potash, with the sweetening process we talked about at the very beginning, as soon as the brine hits the facility, that sweetening process with the air stripper is to remove the hydrogen sulfide from the brine so that it's not there in any of the rest of the process. And then they have the caustic scrubber and the thermal oxidizer to control those emissions of hydrogen sulfide. So we would not expect there to be emissions that people would smell with the control devices that they have, which is quite different from when Cargill was built. But if they do smell anything, then Tammy can talk about how we would deal with that.
Yeah, thanks for doing that, because it's there's a lot of pieces of control equipment. You talked about those when you went through the flow chart. And I know you named them again, but essentially those pieces of equipment are designed to reduce odor causing pollutants and other pollutants from the process. So thanks for going over that. And Tammy, yeah, I definitely want you to talk about what is your process if you would get an odor complaint for this facility or any facility? You know, we have a certain kind of a process that we use to go through this. So if you can just walk people through that, that'd be appreciated.
Certainly. So a lot of our complaints come in, they can come in online via our My Enviro portal. I can get a phone call, you can email me. And when the complaint comes in, the very first thing I do is I look at the weather. What is the meteorology for the area? Where's the wind? What is it swifting? What's the temperature? Because there's a lot of meteorology effects that can make the odor stay down low or go high. And then the next thing I do, depending on how that meteorology report goes, I will get a hold of no matter what, I always get a hold of the complainant to talk to them about it. And if I can get out there, then I try to go out and witness it for myself and stand there with you and get to and smell it with you, or deal with it. And then from there, the levels, the time, sometimes it involves contacting the company to see if they are aware of it, if some equipment went down or something like